Section 22 of The Age of Anne by Edward Ellis Morris. This Librivox Recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 21, Economic and Social, Part 1. Section 1, Population, Towns, Architecture. Before we consider the social and economic condition of the people of England in the reign of Queen Anne, it would be advisable to discover how many people there were. Unfortunately, there is no census to guide us, as it was not until the beginning of this century that statesmen had the wisdom to require an accurate calculation on which taxation could be based. The elements for an estimate are twofold. First, we know the number of houses that paid the hearth tax, which might have been called a house tax, for it was a certain sum from every house, and we can multiply that by what is known to be the average number of inmates of a house, namely 5. Secondly, there was a register of deaths, and a calculation can be based upon the average rate of mortality. This information is not as precise as a census, and the calculations make the population of England and Wales vary between 5 and 7 millions. It is now about 24 millions. He was a wise man who wrote, "It is not growing like a tree in bulk doth make man better be," and a country is not to be considered as necessarily in a better condition because its population has increased. On the contrary, its condition is worse, unless the growth has been proportionate in other respects. Of the whole population of England and Wales, 1/10 was at that time included within London, but with that exception the country had a very much larger share than the towns. Bristol, the next town in population, was only 1/17 of London, and many towns which were considered of importance had populations which would now be thought very small. During the period from Queen Anne's time to our own, the growth of manufactures has been continually drawing the people from the country into towns. If a line be drawn from the mouth of the Severn to the junction of Ouse and Trent, where the river Humber commences, one might say that, roughly speaking, it would now divide the manufacturing from the agricultural parts of the country, that with the exception of London, the great towns lie to the north and west of the line, and that the preponderance of political power rests with them. With equal confidence one might assert that in Queen Anne's time this line separated the important from the unimportant parts of England, all that lay to the north and west being comparatively unimportant. The facilities of locomotion which have helped the growth of manufactures, brought about first by the improvement in roads, then in coaches and wagons, lastly in railways, have also conspired to send the country people into the towns, have emptied the small into the larger towns, have in favour of London destroyed the social prestige of country capitals and of towns which were social centres of large districts. The following may be regarded as a list of the chief English towns after London, in the order of their importance during Queen Anne's reign. Bristol, the chief seaport. Norwich, the largest manufacturing city. York, the capital of the northern counties. Exeter, the capital of the western district. Shrewsbury, of the counties along the Welsh border and well situated for intercourse with Wales. Worcester, in which the porcelain manufacture was beginning to rise. To these would have to be added Derby, Nottingham, Canterbury. The population of London was then about 700,000, that is 1/10 of that of England and Wales. Modern London, with all its suburbs in the widest circuit that is called London, that is to say, the postal districts, covers a much larger area and contains about 4 million inhabitants. This makes it considerably more than 1/10 of the United Kingdom and 1/6 of England and Wales, so that if the growth has been remarkable elsewhere, it has been portentous in London. The earlier growth had been noticed and had caused concern to the government. In the reign of Elizabeth and under the Stuart kings, building had been prohibited, but it was found impossible to stop the growth of London. It would have been as practicable to stop a tree from putting out its branches and its leaves. A great calamity befell London in the reign of Charles II. It was burnt down, but far from checking the growth, this only made room for a fresh start. There was an opportunity to build the city anew on a systematic plan, and the government of the day commissioned the greatest living architect, Sir Christopher Wren, to draw up such a plan for the city. This can still be seen, with his own cathedral of St. Paul's standing in a free space in the centre, broad wide streets leading from it, spacious squares at due intervals, wide and convenient quays along the banks of the Thames. But building in accordance with the plans not being strictly enforced, the opportunity was lost. London was built hastily after the fire, and many conveniences which are now thought necessary and which might have been supplied, had a little more time been taken, were neglected. Not only were the streets narrow and irregular, but there was no arrangement for sewers, and there were no gutters to the streets. The police service also was very bad. The watch was wholly insufficient in numbers, and was composed chiefly of old men. The streets were badly lighted of a night, and it was quite easy for anyone bent on mischief to overpower the watch. Of course, thieves and robbers availed themselves of the power, but others, who should have known better, took occasion not to rob but to riot. Young men of birth and fashion used to form themselves into clubs, banded together for the sole purpose of creating disturbances. The most fashionable of these, the Mohawks, were a terror to all peace-loving citizens, their name being taken from the wild tribe of North American Indians. An ancient writer mentions it as a sign of progress in civilization when men ceased to wear swords. This stage had not been reached in Queen Anne's reign, when the young bucks and dandies of society were always ready to draw their rapiers, and the honest citizens had to arm themselves with bludgeons. The London of Queen Anne's day consisted of two parts, then more distinct than now, the City and Westminster. The space between them was not built over. But London proper, what is strictly called the City, was no longer sufficient to contain all the inhabitants, and fashionable life had already begun that movement to the west, which is so remarkable a feature in the history of London. The fashionable quarters then were the neighbourhood of Great Ormond Street and Queen Square. To the west lay Kensington, a separate village where was King William's palace. Both London and Westminster may be said each to have had two centres, one secular and the other ecclesiastical. London the Exchange and St. Paul's, Westminster the Parliament Houses and the Abbey or Minster, whence the place had its name. The Exchange was the commercial centre, and indeed may be said at this time to have become the centre of the commerce of the world. In the Middle Ages, Venice was the centre of the world's trade. The invention of the compass took away this supremacy from Venice, as mariners were no longer confined to coasting voyages. The extreme commercial activity of the Netherlands next made Bruges and Antwerp the centre, and they retained this supremacy during the Reformation period. The persecution of the Protestants by the Spanish government and the fierce fighting which followed the revolt of the Netherlands destroyed this. Commerce was driven from Antwerp through the long siege by the Duke of Parma, which ended in the year that followed Elizabeth's death. During the next century, the 17th, the supremacy of trade lay between Amsterdam and London, the former having the best of it until the English Civil War was over. But in the latter half of the century, London was beginning to prevail. The commercial rivalry between the English and the Dutch was very keen, and their commerce was nearly equal. But the palm was slowly though surely passing to England. Tyre in Fenelon's Télémaque is supposed to be Amsterdam, but if he had written a quarter of a century later, he would probably have described London. The following passage from the Spectator gives Addison's picture of the Exchange, which, it must be remembered, is neither the Exchange that now is, nor that originally built by Sir Thomas Gresham, but the second, namely, that which was built after the Great Fire, and which was itself destroyed by fire in 1838. There is no place in the town which I so much love to frequent as the Royal Exchange. It gives me a secret satisfaction, and in some measure gratifies my vanity, as I am an Englishman, to see so rich an assembly of countrymen and foreigners consulting together upon the private business of mankind, and making this metropolis a kind of emporium for the whole earth. I must confess I look upon High 'Change to be a great council, in which all considerable nations have their representatives. I have often been pleased to hear disputes adjusted between an inhabitant of Japan and an alderman of London, or to see a subject of the great Mogul entering into a league with one of the Czar of Muscovy. The only art that really flourished in Queen Anne's time was architecture, and that because England happened to possess an architect of consummate genius. Sir Christopher Wren was a man of great attainments, being especially learned in astronomy and in mechanics, and one of the first members of the Royal Society founded in the reign of Charles II. He was as modest as he was learned, and perhaps would have been treated with more respect in that age if he had more firmly asserted his own rights. He was not especially educated for the profession of an architect, but when he was appointed King's Surveyor, he at once showed himself a master of the art. With all the architects of his day, he evidently preferred the classical style. Before the fire, he was asked to restore old St. Paul's, which was in the Gothic style, and he did add some towers to Westminster Abbey, which are amongst his least successful productions. But whilst the question of the restoration of St. Paul's was being debated, and the battle of styles being fought, the great fire put an end to the controversy. St. Paul's is Wren's greatest work, though some say that the church of St. Stephen's, Walbrook, is a more perfect specimen of his art. It was a dean of St. Paul's that wrote of the cathedral, "What eye trained to all that is perfect in architecture does not recognize the inimitable beauty of its lines, the majestic yet airy swelling of its dome, its rich, harmonious ornamentation." As the subscriptions for the rebuilding of St. Paul's did not come in fast enough, Parliament voted that a portion of the duty on coals should be applied to the purpose. The total cost of the cathedral was £747,661 10s. 5d. The first stone was laid in Wren's presence, June 21st, 1675, the 9 years since the fire having been spent in making designs, and the highest stone of the lantern in the cupola was also set by his son in his presence in 1710. It is rare in the history of great buildings, especially of cathedrals, that they should be finished in the lifetime of the original architect. Indeed, it was a marvel both on account of its cheapness and because of the short time in which it was built. After the completion of the cathedral, it was voted by the Parliament in 1711 that 50 new churches should be built, and that the portion of the coal duty which had been expended on St. Paul's should be applied to that purpose. It is not known how many of these churches were actually built, yet we may say that most of the London churches built after the fire are of Wren's building. Fault is found with him because his churches are not Gothic, an objection which seems to imply that there is only one order of ecclesiastical architecture, and surely narrows the art. And also because he mixed the styles in putting steeples, which are a feature of Gothic architecture, over buildings, and especially over porticos, in the Greek style. The defence is this, that architecture having had its full development, an absolutely new invention being impossible, the originality of a modern architect consists in skilful composition and harmonious proportions. If the combination does not offend the eye, it is pedantry to object that it runs counter to the traditions of the art. By way of contrast with Sir C. Wren, it may be well to mention another architect of the day. Sir John Vanbrugh had distinguished himself as a writer of very coarse comic dramas. As men used to change from soldier to sailor, so Sir J. Vanbrugh became an architect. He built his own house out of the ruins of Whitehall. A brother architect compared it to a flat Dutch oven, and Swift has a funny little poem about the house, describing everyone as hunting for it up and down the river banks and unable to find it, until at length they did in the rubbish spy a thing resembling a goose pie. This was the architect who was chosen to build for a grateful nation, at an expense of £500,000, Blenheim Palace near Woodstock, to be presented to the victorious Duke of Marlborough. It is imposing, chiefly on account of its size, but the style is very heavy, and justifies the epigram written on the architect: "Lie heavy on him, earth, for he laid many a heavy load on thee." The immense improvement in one city should be mentioned because it began within this period. Bath was known as a watering place as long ago as the Roman occupation of Britain. It seems always to have preserved its reputation, but it was so uncomfortable that no one cared to stay there, unless for the purposes of health. In the first year of Queen Anne's reign, a man of fashion, one Richard Nash, nicknamed Beau Nash, paid it a visit, as some say, in order to replenish a purse emptied by gambling, as well as to mend health broken by dissipation. He at once set to work to increase the cheerfulness of the place, and to provide amusement for those who resorted to it. His genius for organization was quickly recognized, and he was appointed Master of the Ceremonies in 1704. From that time, for a period of nearly 50 years, he may be described as King of Bath, whilst squares and terraces, pump rooms, and public buildings rose almost like magic, till under his auspices Bath became the well-ordered city that it is now, deserving, with its magnificent situation, the title of the Queen of Watering Places. Section 2. The Poor. Statistics. It seems advisable to collect under one head some scattered information on the history of the English poor. Under the feudal system, the poor man was a serf. The difference between a slave and a serf is that the former is a personal chattel and might be sold. The latter could not be sold away from the estate, but had no personal liberty. He was not able to move from the place where he was born, and he was obliged to serve one particular lord. In A.D. 1346 came the pestilence known as the Black Death, which cut off half the labouring population of England, and by a well-known economic law raised the position of those who were left, because, as there were fewer labourers, their services were more in demand. The result was that Parliament passed the Statute of Labourers, to compel the labourer to work for certain wages. That the position of the labourers was improved is shown by the fact that their class, under Walter the Tiler and others, raised an insurrection at the opening of the next reign, a thing which their grandsires would never have dreamt of doing. The next great event in the history of the poor was the suppression of the monasteries. There can be no doubt that the monasteries supplied bed and board to those who asked, thus conferring a great blessing on those who could not, and an equally great bane on the idle who would not work. The suppression of these religious houses in the reign of Henry VIII had the effect of letting a flood of poor loose upon society, and its necessary results may be seen in two acts of Parliament, the first Poor Law and the first Statute of Vagrants. The statute against vagrants in Henry VIII's reign enacted that the sturdy and valiant beggar, the man who can work and will not, was to be whipped at the cart's tail. The statute of Elizabeth enacted that he was to be whipped and branded in the ear, that whoever liked might put a collar on him and make him a servant. The statute of Charles II that he should be transported to the English plantations beyond the seas. In Queen Anne's reign, a statute was passed that beggars should be put into the army, and as soldiers were well paid, they should certainly have felt that this was kind treatment. The Poor Law of Henry VIII was modified in the reign of Elizabeth, but the statute then passed lasted until the Great Reform Bill. Churchwardens and overseers were to provide work, build poorhouses, and apprentice paupers. It is generally allowed that what the poor can fairly claim is relief for the sick and the infirm who cannot work, and work for those who are able-bodied but who are absolutely unable to find it. It is with the latter in view that what used to be called the poorhouse is now called the workhouse. The workhouse should not be made too comfortable, because men should be taught that they ought to support themselves and not be supported by others. In Queen Anne's reign there were 1,330,000 paupers, or nearly 1 in 5 of the whole population. Men often complain nowadays of the burden of pauperism, but the proportion of paupers has very much diminished. In the year 1873 there were in round numbers 890,000. It is thought that this number is too large, and with discreet measures can and will be reduced. Yet this is only 1 in 27 of the population. Side by side with this calculation one must, however, place the cost. The paupers in Queen Anne's reign cost £900,000 in the year, or about 14 shillings apiece, whilst the poor rate in 1873 amounted to £13 million, or £14 apiece. Now the decrease in the value of money since that time is not nearly in the ratio of 1 to 20. This shows, therefore, that the pauper is more expensively housed and cared for in the present day, and probably also that he is a more permanent charge. For the pauper of Queen Anne's day can only have been at times upon the parish, as the 14 shillings would not suffice to keep him more than a third of the year. As some must have been permanently upon the parish, others, who were but a temporary charge, must be included in the calculation. There is no doubt that the value of money has considerably decreased since the reign of Anne, but it is not easy to find the exact figure by which our money should be multiplied. It is said that the price of a sheep was 7 shillings and of an ox 2 pounds. This would make meat rather less than a penny a pound. The same observer says that 2 pounds 5 shillings would keep a labouring man in food for a year. But prices varied from year to year much more than they vary now, because the country was much more dependent on its own harvest than it is now. In the present day so much corn is imported that the deficiency of an English harvest can be made up without a great or sudden change in general prices. The fluctuations in the price of wheat were remarkable. At 56 shillings 6 a quarter in 1699, it went down to 25 shillings 6 after the abundant harvest of 1702. There was a deficient harvest next year, and prices doubled. In 1706 again we are told that the kingdom was blessed with plenty, and the people cheerfully contributed to the expenses of the war. But the winter of 1708 in England, as in France, was terribly severe. It was noticed that the wheat was all destroyed on the north-east side of the furrows, a fact that points to the prevalence of cutting north-east winds. Wages averaged about 10 pence a day. The pay of a soldier was 8 pence, whereas the French soldier only had 3 pence. A private in the present day receives 1 shilling 2 besides barrack room, pension, and facilities for buying food cheaper. The labourer probably had better wages, but he had no facilities for saving beyond an old stocking. There were no investments open to him, and no savings bank. End of section 22.